Hello and welcome to the Business Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Holly Worton. I've been an entrepreneur since 1999, and I know firsthand how difficult it can be to build a business without the right mindset. This is a podcast for those of us who struggle with showing up in our business with confidence and authenticity, who resist taking big action because of fears and doubts, who know deep down that it's possible to create something bigger, and yet you're not. This podcast combines powerful strategies on how to upgrade your business mindset, along with practical business tips to grow your business more easily in a way that feels aligned. This podcast features solo shows with me and also interviews with inspiring women entrepreneurs from around the world, including my monthly co-hosted episodes with Joe Casey. My goal is to help you grow your business more quickly and easily by transforming your mindset. For me, mindset work is a lifelong practice, and I want to help you make a habit out of mindset work. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, let's get into this week's episode. Hello and welcome to the Business Mindset Podcast, episode 263. This is your host, Holly Worton, and I'm back with another solo episode. I was so happy with last week's episode about how to start a Patreon account, to create a new income stream in your business, and to create more of a community around what you do, and get paid for your content, get paid for your work, and allow people to pay you in kind of different and creative ways based on what they can afford. I'm super excited about Patreon. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I highly recommend that you do. If you have, I would love your feedback. Let me know what you think. And I was so happy with that episode because I love digging really deep into the topic and doing a really in-depth, kind of extended length episode. It was about an hour and 15 minutes long. I really spent some time on the show notes as well. And I've had really great feedback, not only on the episode, but on all the resources I included in these show notes. So again, I really enjoyed last week's episode, and I want to do more of those really in-depth episodes for you. So I look forward to receiving feedback from you on what you want me to delve deeper into. What do you want me to talk about? What do you want me to teach about? What do you want me to introduce to you? What do you want to hear? I would like to do more of those episodes, but again, I'm flexible. I like doing half-hour episodes, but I do really like doing the deep stuff as well. So please let me know if you have any ideas. Today's topic for today's episode also comes from a suggestion from someone in the Facebook group who suggested that I talk about how to start your own podcast. It's a question that I get asked a lot, so often that I've made a very extensive blog post on the topic, and with lots of links, and I keep adding to it, but it's something that I haven't talked about here on the podcast. So I wanted to hopefully dive into this topic and give you some more information on how you can start your own podcast. You're listening to this podcast, so clearly it's a format that you like and perhaps might want to try for yourself. So what are we going to talk about or what am I going to talk about, because I'm alone, this is a solo episode. In today's episode, you will learn what's a podcast. I mean, you should know that if you're listening to this, but I figured I kind of had to cover that anyway. Why you might want to start a podcast, who should start a podcast, how to know that you're ready to start a podcast, how to start your own podcast, how to decide what format you want to use for your show, how to get guests for your show if you decide to do interviews, what gear you need and where to get it, all the tech stuff you need to have, like software and that stuff in order to get started, what things you can do yourself and what you need to outsource or what things you might want to outsource, how to market your podcast, and finally, where to get additional help if you need specialized podcast coaching. However, before we get into today's episode and kind of reaching back to last week's episode on Patreon, I wanted to welcome Esther Lemons as my very first patron on Patreon. So thank you so much for supporting my work and for supporting the show and for being the first person to click to support me on Patreon. I really, really appreciate it. And as I've mentioned on my Patreon profile, I will be giving all new patrons a shout out on the show. So again, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. So getting into this week's episode. What is a podcast? Again, you're listening to this podcast, so I'm sure you've probably got that covered. But I wanted to bring this up because it surprises me how many people still don't know what a podcast is. Podcasting has been around for years and years and years. I started podcasting in almost exactly 5 years ago. So it's actually really exciting for me to be doing this episode now at kind of the 5-year mark. So I started in 2013, but podcasting has been around longer than that. So apparently podcasting used to be called audio blogging, which makes sense because podcasts are kind of like audio blog posts. And apparently it has its roots dating back to the 1980s. However, who ever heard of an audio blog back in the 1980s? Did we have the internet back then? No. So it really didn't catch hold until late 2004. But as I said, there are still plenty of people who don't know what a podcast is. I was just explaining to someone the other day that I had a podcast and I did this thing and I've been doing it for 5 years. And they said, what is a podcast? So I had to explain. So basically it's like a blog, but audio. And I started this podcast, and I know I've mentioned this before, but I started this podcast because I started listening to podcasts back in 2013. Kind of early on in the year. And the very first podcast that I started listening to, and I don't know how I even heard of it, but it was Natalie Sisson's The Suitcase Entrepreneur podcast. And it was the very first show I started listening to. She was doing lots of interviews with people. I loved them. I found it really inspiring. I used to listen to them at the gym. I used to listen to them walking around town. I really liked the format. And this was kind of surprising to me because I'm not naturally an auditory learner. I don't learn well from hearing stuff. I don't learn well, and I don't retain information well from hearing stuff. I learn best through reading, and I retain information the best through reading. I'm a very visual person, but visual in the sense of I like to see the words rather than, say, watching a video. I hate videos. So it's really weird that I like podcasts, and it's really weird that I listen to so many podcasts. So I'm saying this because just because your natural learning style isn't auditory, and maybe it is, but if you're the kind of person who doesn't learn well through auditory stuff, that's fine. That doesn't mean that other people won't want to hear you. And I point this out because this is something that's taken me probably far too long to understand and get used to, because what works for me is not necessarily what's going to work for my audience, and what I like is not going to necessarily work for my audience, and what I don't like may not coincide with my audience doesn't like. So you can't base what's right for your audience or your fans or your community or your tribe based on what you like or dislike. That's really, really important. There are tons of podcasts out there. More and more people are starting podcasts every day. It's like blogging was years and years and years ago. And don't be put off by that. I mean, no one would say, oh, it's 2018, it's far too late to start a blog. You shouldn't do that because there's so many blogs out there. So don't believe anyone who says that about podcasting. And people do say that about podcasting, and I think that's absolutely ridiculous. Everyone's voice is different. Everyone's perspective is different. Everyone's perspective is valid. If you want to start a podcast, absolutely start a podcast. So that leads me into, why might you want to start a podcast? So I started the show again because I was listening to Natalie Sisson, loved her, and I started listening to other interview kind of style podcasts where they were interviewing other entrepreneurs, and I realized I couldn't find any podcast that exclusively interviewed women entrepreneurs. And that bothered me because that's what I wanted. And I couldn't find it. And so I asked about it online. I remember asking about it in like online communities that I belonged to. No one knew of anything. Couldn't find it. So I thought, okay, if I can't find what I want to listen to, then I guess I have to create it myself. And this was a really strong intuitive nudge that I got. And it kept coming back to me. And so this happened probably early, I don't know, maybe springtime 2013. And by August of that year, I had launched my first episodes of this show. So I saw a clear niche in the market that wasn't being filled, and I wanted to fill it. Now, since then, women podcasting, interviewing other women entrepreneurs, that's exploded, and there are so many podcasts like that, which is fantastic. But I started mine because I couldn't find what I wanted to listen to. So I decided to create it myself. So why might you want to start a podcast? Maybe you've been wanting to hear a podcast based on whatever your area of expertise is, but you can't find it. So there's an opening in the market and you might want to do it yourself. Maybe you're feeling lonely because you're working at home, all alone in your office, and you want to reach out and have more connections with people. Maybe you want to build your network, get to know new entrepreneurs by doing interviews. Maybe you want to kind of raise your profile by interviewing high-level people in your field. There are so many reasons why you might want to start a podcast. Maybe your business coach has been saying you need to start a blog, but you really hate writing, but you're really good at talking. That's absolutely a perfect alternative. There's so many reasons you might want to start a podcast. But I think it's really clear that you get clear on why you want to start a podcast. So rather than just kind of jumping on the podcast bandwagon and saying, oh, well, everyone's podcasting now, so I should do it myself. Get clear on why you really want to start a podcast. Like, are you getting a really clear intuitive nudge like I did that you need to do this? Do you have also a strong practical reason why you want to do it like I did? Like, I couldn't find what I wanted, so I decided to create it. I think you need to get clear on the why, because if you're just doing it because everyone else seems to be doing it, then I don't think that's a good enough reason, because it is a lot of work, and it's a lot of work to be consistent, and you want to be consistent. You absolutely want to be consistent with the podcast. So I think getting clear on your why from the start is really, really important. And I think that's one of the first things you need to do. Why do you want to start this podcast? So if it helps for you to pause this episode right now and write down, why do I want to start this podcast? Do that. And if you're not quite sure now, just figure that out later. But I do think it's a really very important step before you move further on this. So who should start a podcast? I mean, really anyone who has something to say, who wants to start a podcast, who has a need, a desire, an interest in creating content of the audio format. I really think podcasting, like blogging, is something that pretty much anyone can do, as long as you want to create something of quality that people would be, interested in listening to, that they'll find useful or entertaining. I think that's good enough. Like, you don't need any credentials. You don't need a super radio voice. You don't need a special degree. Create your podcast based on whatever work you do. Whether you're a coach, whether you're some kind of creative, like if you can write a blog, you can do a podcast. As long as you know how to speak and you can speak fairly clearly or clearly enough for people to understand you. So I really think this is something that's open to anyone that wants to get their voice out there. And again, I think that everyone's going to have their own unique perspective and their own unique things to say and their own unique contributions. And I absolutely think that if you want to start a podcast, you know why you want to start a podcast, you know what you want to talk about, you should go ahead and do it. It is work, but it's not that hard, and you can do it. Absolutely. So how do you know you're ready to start a podcast? I think as long as you have got your why, you know why you want to start a podcast, you are willing to put in the time and the work to make it happen. And you're willing to do the foundation work in terms of deciding what format you want to use, what you want to talk about, that kind of thing. I think you're ready. You also need to be willing to do the marketing. Podcasting is like any other type of content that you might create, whether it's a YouTube video or a blog post. Yeah, people might be searching for your topic and come across it on Google, but really, you're not going to build an audience unless you're willing to promote the show, get your episodes out there, and really market it. You've got to get your stuff out there. I honestly don't spend a whole lot of time marketing my podcast. I probably spend about half an hour each week promoting each episode. I do have the Facebook group where we kind of continue the conversation. But you've got to do something to get it out there, and you've got to be willing to do something to get it out there. Because if you just start recording a bunch of stuff, you put it up on iTunes, yeah, you might get a handful of listeners, but it's going to be really slow going. And another thing to point out is a lot of people who are new to podcasting think that, oh, well, I'll just do an interview show, and then I'll get all of my guests to promote the episode for me. Now, as I will talk about later, yeah, guests should do their part in promoting all the podcasts that they're a guest on, but most people don't. Unless you're exclusively interviewing other podcasters who know the importance and the value of helping you to promote the episode, most people who aren't podcasters won't do very much to promote the episode. So don't rely on guests. Don't decide to do an interview format show because you think they'll do the marketing for you. Probably won't happen. Again, you can be strategic about that and only invite other podcasters to be a guest on your show, but again, that's not guaranteed. You really need to do the work yourself. And it doesn't need to be a lot of work and it doesn't need to be hard work, but you do need to be willing to market the podcast. So I think that kind of wraps up how to know that you're ready to start a podcast. There's work involved. You've got to be willing to do it. You've got to be willing to create quality audio for people to listen to because there's nothing more annoying than bad audio. And if your audio quality is terrible, people probably won't listen to your show, or they might listen to an episode or part of an episode and never listen to you again because it's really annoying to listen to poor quality audio. So, how to start your own podcast? As I said, I've got a blog post on this topic. It's called How to Start Your Own Podcast. I have a ton of links in there and I link to that blog post in the show notes. But basically, you've got things that you need to get, some foundation work that you need to do, figure out your marketing strategy, record your stuff, and then do the launch. So I'm going to walk you through some of these steps, and I'm also going to recommend that you download, I'm going to put together a little checklist that I'm going to link to in the show notes, and again, you'll be able to download that, no opt-in required, you can just get the thing. So one book that I've always recommended is John Lee Dumas wrote a book called Podcast Launch. And that is an excellent, excellent, excellent book on how to launch your podcast. It's super short. It's a Kindle book. It will teach you everything you need to know about launching a podcast. So I'll link to that in the show notes, but basically it's called Podcast Launch, How to Create, Grow, and Monetize Your Podcast. And it also includes 15 video tutorials that will teach you how to kind of do the tech stuff that you need to do in terms of hosting and uploading to iTunes and that kind of thing. So I really recommend that as a starting point. The next thing that I always recommend is the She Podcasts podcast and Facebook group and trainings. So if you've not heard of She Podcasts, I will link to them in the show notes. It's two fantastic women, Elsie Escobar and Jessica Kupferman. I've mentioned them before here on the show. They've got a fantastic Facebook group on podcasting, women who podcast. They've also got some free trainings in there, and they've got a podcast that talks about podcasting. So sign up for the Facebook group, do the trainings or not, but do listen to their podcast as well because I think that's really, really useful. I also think that if you only listen to a couple of podcasts, I would say start subscribing to more podcasts so you can get an idea of what other people do, what you like, what you don't like. So kind of for a little bit as you're kind of doing your research before you start your own podcast, try to expand your menu of podcasts that you listen to because that will teach you a lot about what you want to do and what you don't want to do. So I think that can be really, really helpful. So next, you need to get clear on your topic. What are you going to talk about? Now, this podcast has changed names and it's changed formats and it's changed kind of topics over the years. It started out as a purely interview show where I would interview other women entrepreneurs. Then I started adding solo episodes. I was talking about all kinds of business stuff. Now I'm focusing more on business mindset and stuff related to being an entrepreneur online and having your own business. That's my topic. What are you going to talk about? Ideally, it should either be something related to your business, if that's the point of your podcast, is to have something related to your business, or if you want to do a podcast related to a hobby and just do it for fun, absolutely, that's something you can do. But you need to figure out what you're going to talk about. What is the point of the podcast? And why would people want to listen to it? Like, what are they going to learn, or how are they going to be entertained? So get clear on what the topic is and what's the point of it. And do some research. Look at what other podcasts might exist around that topic. This is obviously not the only business mindset podcast. There are other ones out there. So get a feel for what already exists and how you can add to the conversation around that topic. Next, get clear on who's going to be on your podcast. Is it going to be a solo show? Is it just going to be you talking every week? Or will you have a co-host? Someone who shows up with you every week or once a month or twice a month to talk about your topic? Or will you be doing interviews? Interviews are a lot of work in terms of finding people, making sure they have all the information they need, making sure you get their bio, their photo, all their stuff, setting up time for the interview, using your online calendar. Sometimes people show up, sometimes people don't show up, sometimes people are late. It's a bit more complicated. But it can be a great way to get started because it's a back and forth. It's a conversation. It's you showcasing someone else's expertise and having a conversation around a topic that's related to the main topic of your podcast. So interviews are great, can be kind of a pain, but they can also be really, really, really rewarding. So who's going to be on your podcast? You can have a mix. So as you know from listening to this show, I used to do interviews. I don't anymore. Now I'm just doing solo episodes like this one and co-hosted episodes with Joe and Joanna. So what do you want to do? And you can change this up whenever you like. I changed so many times over the years and I will probably change again at some point. So just figure out what you want to do and then know that you can be flexible. Next, what's your schedule going to be? How often do you want to release an episode? Every week, every day, twice a month, once a month. Probably once a month is not often enough for people to get used to hearing you. I would probably forget about someone if I only heard from their podcast once a month. But again, you can be flexible with this. So when I first got the idea for this podcast, my idea was to release an episode twice a month, every other week. But once I started doing the interviews, before I even went live with the podcast, I decided I enjoyed doing the interviews so much, I wanted to make it weekly. So the idea when I started out was twice a month, but by the time I launched, it was once a week. And I have stuck to that ever since. So I think you need to figure out what you can do, what you can fit into your schedule, what's reasonable for you, and then again, be flexible. Know that you can change it. Know that you can make it more often, make it less often, as long as you communicate that to your audience so they know what to expect from you. I do, however, think that you need to be regular. People need to know when they can expect to hear from you. And this is the kind of advice that you hear for every kind of content, whether it's your email newsletter, your blog, your podcast, your videos, whatever. I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again because we're talking specifically about podcasts now. The only type of content that I have been able to be consistent with over the last 5 years is my podcast. I have not been consistent with blog posts. I've not been consistent with videos. I've not been consistent with my email newsletters. This has been super easy for me to be consistent with. And I think that's also something that's kept me going with the podcast, even though it's not a format that I necessarily found natural, because I'm not a natural talkative person. I'm more of a writer. But I think what kept me going was seeing how easy it was for me and seeing that as kind of a sign. Like, if this is so easy for me to produce, then obviously this is the thing I need to stick with. It's working for me. So figure out your schedule, be consistent, but know you can be flexible. So if you want to change, just make it clear to your audience that you're going to change. But try not to be sporadic. Next, length. How long are your episodes going to be? Are they going to be short sound bites? Lots of people do kind of 7-minute, 15-minute episodes. Half an hour, longer. You're going to do long form episodes or interviews that are like 2 or 3 hours long. That exists. Some people do that. It's unusual, but it's there. So what resonates with you? And again, you can change this. In the beginning, I was so good at keeping everything to a half an hour because I thought that was the kind of the ideal length for a podcast episode. It was what I thought would work. It was what I enjoyed. And then I realized I wanted to go deeper and I wanted to create longer episodes. And so I started experimenting with that with my episodes with Joe Casey and then my episodes with Joanna Hennon. And now with my solo episodes, I've been starting to go longer on some of my episodes as well. So I really enjoy doing them somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour or longer. I really like to dig deep into the topic. I'm not always good at that on my solo episodes because, again, I'm not a naturally chatty person, but it's what I like. I really feel like I'm delivering quality content to you and giving you something to listen to and think about. And that's part of the reason why I stopped doing interviews, because I felt like the interviews were really shallow and couldn't delve deep enough into the conversation. And I may bring back interviews in the future, perhaps with people that I know well enough to have a deeper conversation with. We will see how that goes. But I definitely know if I do bring back interviews, they're going to be longer and they're going to be deeper, because I fed up with the shallow half-hour interview, which is what I felt I was stuck in. But that's me. What is right for you? How long will your episodes be? Are they going to be short? Are they going to be a half hour, an hour, longer? Go with what's right for you and be flexible. Change it up when you need to. Finally, and I think this is a really important thing that you need to get clarity on before you get started with the podcast. Are you going to edit it yourself, or are you going to hire someone? Because if you outsource, you're going to need to find someone. And if you need someone to edit your podcast, do get in touch with me once you're ready to get started, and I will recommend someone to you. But one of the reasons that I think I've been so consistent with this podcast is because I realized from the beginning I did not want to edit myself. I did not want to learn audio editing. I was not interested at all. I wanted to hire someone. And I found someone who's been working with this show from the very beginning and is still with me 5 years later. So, do you like audio editing? Is it something that you like to play with? Is it something you want to learn? Do you have the time? Do you have the inclination? Does it sound fun? Or do you want to outsource it? Can you afford to outsource it? I think that the kind of success of my consistency is due to the fact that I have outsourced this from day one. So get clear on whether you're going to do it yourself or hire someone. So that's kind of the list of things that you need to get clear on. And again, you can be flexible with all this. You can change the topic. You can change the format. You can change the schedule. You can change the length. You can hire an editor if you don't get one from the start. So get clear on all that stuff before you move forward with actually doing the podcast. So before you get ready to record your episodes, you're going to need to get some stuff. So you're going to need to buy a decent quality microphone. The one that I use and the one that a lot of podcasters use is the Blue Yeti. And I will link to that in the show notes so you know what that is. I got it on Amazon. It's not my first microphone. I used to have a Zoom H2N, which I bought back in 2011 or 2012. I bought for my first online course. I loved it at the time, but I had problems with it. It had problems with my first one, had to send it in, get a new one. Then the new one died, and I've had the Blue Yeti ever since, and it's worked beautifully. So I'm super, super happy with this microphone. I think it's reasonably priced. It's a very commonly used microphone by podcasters. And again, I will link to it in the show notes so you can take a look at it. I got mine on Amazon. So buy your microphone and then make sure that the settings are right for doing a podcast. Next, buy headphones or earbuds if you don't have them already. Probably you will. They don't need to be super quality, but you will need them, especially if you're doing interviews. Next, get the software that you're going to need for recording. So if you're doing interviews and you're on a Mac, you'll want Skype and Ecamm call recorder or Zoom. Zoom has an internal recording setting that you can use. However, the thing I don't like about Zoom is that it records both people on the same channel, whereas Ecamm call recorder records both voices if you're doing interviews again on separate channels, which is really important in case something happens to one of the sides. So I had one episode that I recorded a couple of years ago where I had a problem with my microphone. It was not the Blue Yeti, it was the H2N, and something happened. I didn't touch the settings, but something happened to the microphone that made me sound like a little mouse. It was like the pitch was wrong. So my guest sounded fantastic, and I sounded like a little mouse. And there was no way I could release that thing. So I asked my podcast editor if he could do anything about it. He said he couldn't. I asked my guest if she could re-record, and she said, look, I'm busy for the next few months. So I went on Fiverr, found an audio guy, said, look, I've got this problem. Can you do something? He said, yes, absolutely. He fixed it for me. And that was possible because I'd used Ecamm call recorder and Skype, and I had both of our voices on separate tracks. If I had done it on Zoom, he wouldn't have been able to fix it. So that's why I use Skype and Ecamm rather than Zoom. My personal preference? I know lots of people use Zoom or other things to record. If you're doing a solo episode, you will want to record on either GarageBand or Audacity, which is what I use, which is free open source software you can download for either Mac or PC. And if you do your own editing, you can also edit in Audacity. I find it really easy to use for my solo episodes like this one. So get the software you'll need for recording based on whatever your format is. Next, you're going to need to record an intro and outro to your podcast. The intro outro is kind of the introduction at the beginning and the kind of sign off at the end that's going to be kind of tacked onto every single episode. So it's not the start of the episode where you're like, hey, this is episode number 3. You're going to learn this, this, and this. It's kind of the generic thing that goes on every episode at the beginning and end. So usually those will have music, which you can get. You'll want royalty-free music you can get online. I got mine from soundrangers.com. It was very affordable. I think it was maybe $30, and I've been using the same music for the last 5 years, so it was an excellent investment. And you will want to decide whether you want to do your own intro outro like I do now, or whether you want someone else to do it for you. So kind of the trend used to be that lots of people would have someone else do their intro outro for them. And I've had a couple of different voice actors do mine over the years because I really liked that format. Until you guys listening to the podcast in the Facebook group said to me, I don't like that woman. Can you do it yourself? Why don't you do it yourself? Enough people said to me, why don't you do it yourself? That I finally scrapped the old intro outro and started doing it myself. So get clear on what you prefer. I liked having the intro outro done by someone else, but my listeners didn't. So well, I'm not going to insist on having it done by someone else. I'm going to do what you guys want to hear. So I changed it up. So again, you can change whenever you want. I've had, like I said, a couple of different voice actors do mine. I found them on Fiverr. I thought they were really good, especially the second one. I really like the second one. But go with what's right for you. And again, know that you can change it at any time. Next, you're going to need your cover artwork and your graphics designed for each individual episode. So the cover artwork is kind of like your album cover that is going to go on every single episode, and that people will see on iTunes or wherever it is that they download your podcast from. You can either do that yourself on Canva if you're a snazzy graphic design kind of person, or hire an expert, hire a graphic designer. This is the kind of thing that I think really needs to look professional. It shouldn't look homemade. It shouldn't look kind of thrown together by someone who doesn't have an eye for design. So again, do it yourself at your own risk, or hire someone who can do this for you. I will link in the show notes to someone who can help you with that. Next, you'll need somewhere to host your audio files. And one of the most common hosts is called Libsyn for Liberated Syndication. I use the $15 a month plan, and that's one that I've always used from the very start. So I will link to that in the show notes. That's basically like how you would host anything else, whether it's hosting ebooks or your website or that kind of thing. This is a place where you will upload your audio files, and then from there it will be syndicated out to iTunes and TuneIn and all Stitcher and all the other kind of apps and places that people will actually subscribe to the podcast. So that's all the stuff you need to get, both tangible and technical. Next, marketing. You need to either create a marketing plan for your podcast or use the current strategy that you use for your other content, assuming that it works. You really need to get this out there. Again, don't expect to just create a podcast, put it out there, and people will just magically find it, because that doesn't happen. So really be sure that you're ready to put in the time and the energy that you need to market this podcast. So now that you've got all this stuff done, you've got clarity on your format, what the podcast is going to be about, you've got all the stuff, you've got your marketing plan, you need to start recording your episodes. So I would recommend that you record an episode 0, which I did not do because, I don't know, didn't think about it back when I did my podcast. But now it's quite common for people to record a very short episode 0 where they just kind of say, hey, this is me. I'm going to be talking about this stuff on this podcast. And this is the format. This is how often you can expect it. It's just a quick kind of introduction to the podcast so that people know who you are. They know what to expect. Something short and sweet, episode 0. Then you'll want to submit your podcast to iTunes. Once you've set up episode 0, or your audio guy or girl, woman, has set up episode 0 on your Libsyn account. Because iTunes needs to see that you are already producing stuff and that it's a live podcast feed. So record your episode 0, upload it to iTunes, upload it to Libsyn, submit it to iTunes, and then you can upload all the other stuff. Usually people recommend launching with at least 3 episodes. That's what I did. And I think that's a really good way for people to get to know you from the start, because oftentimes if you discover a brand new podcast, you listen to an episode and then you forget about it. Whereas if the person's got 2 other episodes for you to listen to, you can listen to them right away. So record your episode 0, 1, 2, and 3, upload episode 0, submit to iTunes, then launch the other 3 episodes. That is what I would recommend. Do what's right for you, but I really recommend launching with at least 3 episodes. Next, you absolutely want to set this up before you launch. Add a podcast page or section to your website. So I set up all of my show notes as blog posts, and I tag them with the category podcast. But I also have a page on my website, which is hollyworton.com/podcast, and I'll link to that in the show notes, where you can click and you can learn all about the podcast. So I think that's really useful to have because it's kind of a one-stop shop to all the links to everything. So that page has a little introduction about the podcast. It has a list of every single episode that I've ever released with links to the individual blog posts. It used to have the link to how you could pitch yourself to be a guest on the show. Now it says that I don't take guests. It has just all the information that people would need about the podcast. It has all the links to where you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Android, all that stuff. Google Play. So it's just a nice kind of catch-all of all the stuff that people need to know and all the links they need for the podcast. So that, to me, is all the stuff that you absolutely need to do before you launch. Now, after you launch, I would say if you're going to do interviews, create a Google form for people who pitch you to be a guest on your podcast, because once you've been around for a while, people will start pitching themselves to be a guest on your podcast. Some of those people will be appropriate, a lot of them won't be. Rather than doing the work yourself of creating a spreadsheet with all these people and all their information, Google Forms will do that for you. So if you create a Google form with questions to see if they're a good fit, Google will compile all of that into a spreadsheet for you. So I will link to the one that I used to use in the show notes, and you can use that as an example. Feel free to copy it. I found it really useful because of all the people who pitch me to be a guest on my show. And people still pitch me to be a guest on my show, even though I clearly say in at least 2 places on my website I do not do interviews. I still get pitches. Out of all the people who pitched back when I had this form set up, I would say only about half of them actually would click through and fill out the form. And I feel like if someone's not going to take 10 or 15 minutes to fill out that form, then you don't really want them to be a guest on your show, because if they can't put in the effort, then why should you? So again, I will link to my Google form, and you can copy that or adapt it as you need. So use that for people to pitch you. Next, you want to submit your podcast to all the different places that people will subscribe to podcasts. So Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Play, all of those. And then there are other places you can submit your podcast to as well. I will include a link in the show notes. If you have an interview show and you do guests, I highly recommend you create a kind of PDF document with information about your show and guidelines for your guests in terms of what you expect from them. So some people are used to podcasting, they're used to being a guest on other people's shows, and they will know how to behave. They will know to take off any noisy jewelry. They will know to use a good microphone. They will know to use headphones. They will know to get rid of their barking dog. They will know what to do to create good audio environment on their end. Some people don't, so you need to teach them. So have a PDF that teaches people what they need to know to be a guest on your show. I will link to mine in the show notes so that you can download it yourself. The last thing that you kind of need to do until it can wait until after you launch is decide whether or not you want to do transcripts for your show. I'm going to link in the show notes to the woman who does my transcripts. She is absolutely fantastic. I've worked with other people on transcripts before. They have been not so good. She's fantastic, so I highly recommend her, and I will link to her in the show notes. So if you want transcripts, I think they're really, really useful because they're good for Google because it's more written content for your website, but it's also useful for people who aren't great auditory learners. So what I do with my transcripts is I copy and paste them into the show notes at the end of the show notes so people can just scroll through and read them. But I also provide a free PDF download. So people can also download the PDF of the transcript. And they can do that for free. So there's no opt-in required. You just click, you download, it's yours. You could also use that as a free opt-in for your website. As you may know, I've removed all of my opt-in gifts and made them absolutely free. And I'm just having people sign up to my newsletter rather than bribing them with downloadable thingy. So that's not my strategy anymore, but that's absolutely something you can do if you still do that. So again, all the stuff that I've just run through, stuff you need to do to get started, the stuff you need to get clarity on, the stuff you need to buy, your marketing plan, things you need to do before you launch, things that can wait until after your launch, that's going to be in a podcast launch checklist, which you can download again for free, no opt-in required, in the show notes for this episode, which you'll be able to find at hollyworton.com/263. So that was very long-winded, but I think that was important to give you an idea of all the things that you need to think about and that you need to plan before you start your podcast. I think that from the moment you decide you're going to start a podcast, you need to give yourself a deadline for launching your show. Again, it was 5 years ago, so I don't remember exactly the amount of time between idea to launching, but I think I got the idea around April or May, and I launched in August. So it was about, 3 months or so, which I think is reasonable. I think it's a reasonable amount of time to figure everything out, get all your stuff together, and get your first episodes in the pipeline for launching. So that's all the stuff you need to plan. So next thing I want to talk about is if you choose to do interviews and have guests on your show, where do you get them? So before I launched my show, I made a spreadsheet with 3 different tabs. They were called 1, 2, and 3. And 1 was the list of people that I knew, people that knew me, people that I thought would be easy to get on the show, people that were an easy yes. Number 2 were people who were maybe I kind of knew them, but not so well, or they were friends of friends, or I knew someone who knew them. And then group 3 were kind of the bigger name guests, people that I didn't know and didn't think I had any connection to, and those were kind of my wish list of people. So I started out with the easy people, the people that I knew, the people that I knew I liked, the people that I knew liked me, and I got going with them because I knew they were people that I would find it easy to talk to and easy to interview. Now, people always get surprised when I say this, but I used to get really nervous for these interviews because I was new to interviewing, so I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I had listened to tons of interviews, but I was just new to actually doing it. And I used to get really, really nervous to the point where I used to take Rescue Remedy, which, if you know, it's a flower essence thingy to help with nervousness. I would take that before every interview because I would get so nervous. I don't do that anymore. I haven't done that in a long time, but in the beginning and for the first few months, I think, I would take my Rescue Remedy about 15 minutes before each episode because I would get so nervous. And this is, I think, something important to point out because if you start inviting people to be a guest on your show who aren't used to being podcast guests, they might be nervous too. So be aware that your guest might be nervous. I think that's something that's really, really important to kind of think of because you'll need to kind of have a little chat before the interview so that you can create rapport and that kind of thing. And just be aware and see if you feel like they might be nervous, see what you can do to kind of make them more comfortable. So I really liked my 1, 2, 3 spreadsheet. That really worked. And then I just reached out and sent emails to people. And then once I started inviting some of the level 3 podcast guests to my show, what I ended up doing was I ended up getting my business coach at the time she had offered to introduce me to some people. So she said, send me your wish list of people that you want, people that you know I know, and I will introduce you. So that's how I got a lot of kind of the level 3 people on my show. I asked for an introduction, and lots of people will be happy to send you an introduction. Lots of people like to be interviewed by podcasts as part of their marketing strategy. So a lot of people will be open to being on your show. Some people will require that maybe you've got an established show with at least 20 episodes. Some people will require that you have at least 5,000 or 10,000 people on your email list. Do what you can. And start with what works for you. Maybe you want to go straight to your level 3 big names. Maybe you want to make it easy like I did. Do what works for you. There is another research that's really good, not only for getting guests for your show, but also being featured on other people's shows. And it's called podcastguests.com. It's a free service for pitching yourself to be a guest on shows. But if you want to use it to get guests, there is a payment required, I believe. But look into them. They're really great. It's an email that you sign up for, and people sign up to that to see if they can be a guest on different shows. So that's another good way to get people who are out of your usual networking circles, which I think is really important. So you're not just kind of stuck in your own social circles and entrepreneurial circles. So you can also, another thing a lot of people do is, when I've been a guest on other people's podcasts, a lot of people say, please send me an email with other women that you think would be a good fit for this show, or other people that would be a good fit for this show. And I've sent out names of people that I know are good at doing interviews. So that's another way to get people on your podcast. And I think that's another good way of extending your reach is you interview someone on your podcast, you ask them for maybe 3 recommendations of people, and the odds are you might not know those people. So that will help you to expand your network and expand your community and expand the people that you know and get you talking to new people. So getting guests for your interviews is really, really easy, but you do need to plan in advance. So when I did interviews, I would try to record the interviews at least 8 weeks out. Because again, sometimes stuff comes up, they have to cancel, you have to reschedule, and it's kind of a pain. So if you do interviews on your podcast, know that you're going to need to plan in advance. And I think that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind. So as I said before, you need to market your podcast. So how are you going to do that? Market it how you market your other stuff online. Mention it in your newsletter. Mention it on your social media. Mention it when you're at a networking group. Get business cards done. You can get square business cards on moo.com or moo.co.uk with your podcast cover artwork, and you can put the link to your podcast on there. There's so many different ways. You know how to market. I'm going to assume if you don't, Google how to market your podcast, how to market your content, but use the regular channels that you use to market your business, but really get it out there. Don't be afraid to put this out there. Don't be afraid to share it online. Really put it out there. You need to do the work to get the listeners. Don't rely on iTunes recommending it to people. Next thing I want to talk about is how to get the mindset that you need to start your own podcast, because this can be scary. A lot of people can be afraid to start their own podcast because they think, who am I to start a podcast? What are people going to think? What will they think of me? What will they think of the people that I choose to be my guest? What will they think of my opinions? What will they think of what I have to say? Do I have anything to say? Do I have anything important to say? Do I have anything interesting to say? Am I boring? Will people hate it? I don't know. This mind crap can come up when you think about doing a new thing like a podcast. So as I said before, absolutely there is space in the marketplace for new quality podcasts. Again, you want to create something that is of quality. You want to put your best effort into it. You want to make good sound quality. You want to have good editing. But if you want to do this, your voice is absolutely valid and interesting and useful, and get it out there. This is no more of a big deal than it is to start a blog. So if you've started a blog and you've been blogging, then know that you can start a podcast too. But think about the things that you need to work on mindset-wise in order to make it easier for you to launch this podcast successfully. So see if you need to work on your beliefs around setting goals and achieving your goals and taking action towards your goals. Think about what kinds of boundaries you need to set with your podcast guests if you choose to do interviews. Think about what beliefs you need to have around your ability to set and uphold boundaries. If people cancel on you a couple of times, are you going to keep giving them the chance to sign up? Think about your level of confidence, your trust in yourself, your trust in your ability to create something like this. Think about your confidence as a speaker. Think about your beliefs that you have around your ability to be creative, to be a creative entrepreneur. Look at your beliefs around your ability to be a leader in your field. And your ability to outsource things to other people if you choose to do so. Because when you outsource things, you need to be able to manage those people. So what do you believe about your ability to effectively and efficiently outsource things to other people? What about learning? Because you're probably going to learn things. You're going to have to learn new things when it comes to creating this podcast and launching this podcast. So what do you believe about your ability to learn new things? Lots of people have blocks and fears around their ability to learn because maybe they had a teacher that told them they were stupid, or they were a bad learner, or they were bad at focusing, whatever it is. What are your beliefs around your ability to learn new things, such as podcasting? Next, marketing. What are your beliefs around your ability to market this podcast successfully and build a listener base that steadily increases? What about your beliefs around your ability to be successful and to create new opportunities for yourself and your business? And what are your beliefs around the value that you bring, or the value that you could bring to a podcast? And what are your beliefs around your self-worth, your innate worthiness of speaking up and creating a platform like this to share your message? And related to that, what are your beliefs around visibility? Because creating a podcast like this, or podcast of any kind, and getting it out there and marketing it and being visible can trigger a lot of stuff for people. Especially, there's something about the speaking thing that can be really triggering for people. So make sure that you have the beliefs that you need in order to do something like this. And if you have already trained in a technique that can help you change your beliefs and get the mindset that you need, fantastic, do the work. Or work with someone else, whether that's me or someone else who can help you change your beliefs and get the mindset you need to create a successful podcast. Finally, if you need any additional help in terms of specialized podcast coaching, I highly recommend Elsie Escobar. She's got a program called the E-League, which I did, it was about a year ago or a year and a half ago. I was in the very first E-League group of people that did it. Absolutely fantastic. I was so impressed at Elsie's ability to just research my podcast. She really, really looked online, researched me incredibly thoroughly. I don't know if I would recommend working with her before you've got a podcast. She's fantastic with everything, but I think you would probably get the most out of it once you've got it going and once you've kind of come to some blocks and you need some help getting through them. However, take a look at her. If you feel like you need help, do check her out. Talk to her, see if she thinks you're a good fit or not. She is the best. I love her. She's fantastic. Again, I'll link to Elsie in the show notes so you can see her. That is about it for today. This is about going over an hour now. And I feel like this has been juicy enough for you to get a good idea of how you can start your own podcast. Again, I've loads of links in the show notes. I've also got 3 additional resources on the blog. One of them is my top 10 plus tips on how to make your podcast guests feel special. Next one is top 10 plus tips on how to be a stellar podcast guest. And the final one is top 10 plus tips on pitching yourself to be a guest on someone else's podcast. I think those 3 would be really, really useful for you to read. I'm linking to those in the show notes as well as everything else that I've mentioned today. This has been a super robust episode. I'm really, really pleased with it. I'm so thankful for this topic. So if you have any ideas for any other podcast topics in the future, please, please, please let me know. Let me know what you want to hear, what you think would be interesting, useful, etc. And if it's relevant, I will do it. Finally, if you get any use out of this podcast, and if you've subscribed to it, I'm assuming you do, I would like to invite you to support this show and my work on Patreon. You can become a patron from as little as $1 a month, and I invite you to check it out. So if you head over to patreon.com/Holly Worton, you can become a patron. Again, starting at $1 a month, going on up, you can get different rewards. I will be providing a special patron-only audio feed for people who want additional information on these episodes, but also kind of additional monthly Q&As and that kind of thing, and more. There's a lot of stuff that I'm offering on Patreon. But again, if you have found this podcast useful, if this is something that you listen to, I would love to have your support with this show. I've been doing this for 5 years now, and I would like to create more of a community around the show beyond just what I've got going in the Facebook group. So again, if you would like to support me, please head over to patreon.com/Holly Worton, and you can check out my profile there and sign up to be a patron. Finally, you are welcome to join the Facebook group. If you head over to hollywharton.com/group, you will be redirected to the Facebook group, and we can have a chat there about what you thought of this week's episode. If you have any more questions, you can ask me in there. And again, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a quick review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, and I will see you back next week for another episode of the Business Mindset Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and remember to visit hollywharton.com/263 for the show notes on this episode. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to the Business Mindset Podcast. You can find more information about today's episode, including links for the topics that were discussed, at hollywharton.com. If you'd like to connect with other listeners and learn more about business mindset, join my private community for entrepreneurs at hollywharton.com/group. That will redirect you to the Facebook group. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to head over to iTunes and leave a quick review of this podcast. It just takes a minute. Thank you so much.